Welcome to Connected Conversations. I am Elena Petrova, founder and CEO of Adastra Inc. Let's share the inspiring stories, strengthen our bonds, and pave the way for a brighter future, one conversation at a time. Welcome to Connected Conversations with Elena Petrova. Today I have a very special guest, Bill Rivas.
Oh.
Yes, that's you, the legend of our industry. Thank you so much, Bill, for doing all this incredible work for us, particularly today and the time of challenge. And thank you for joining us again. I would like to ask you to give us some support. We really need it, not just for me, but for my team. My team is based all over the globe. We have presence here in Washington, D.C., in Buenos Aires, in Cordoba, Argentina, in Egypt, in Europe, and all those wonderful people behind the scene are helping me to make this happen. So please give us some support, give us a like, give us a comment in the comment section so we can continue growing Adastra community. Because our podcast is about leaders, it's about communities connecting to each other. And so the leaders of local communities can learn from each other because we are so connected on social media. But in reality, we are all lonely at home. And in today's world, all we need is each other to grow, to learn, and make a change, because the change starts at home. So thank you again for making it all happen. Back to you, Bill.
Well, thanks, Lena. And I'm not sure I'm a legend. The mustache might be a legend, but I don't think I'm a legend.
Yes, you are. You have done so much for our industry. When did you join our industry?
My first gig as an independent contractor, a Russian English-Russian interpreter, was in, I think it was the fall of 1988. I'd actually have to go back and look it up, at the NASA Goddard Space Flight Center. I was an engineering major, aerospace engineering at a Russian major, and one day the phone rang out in the dorm. You could dial 4 digits on campus, and there was one old rotary dial phone for all 55 guys on one side of the dorm. Hey, Rivers, it's for you. Okay, I go out. Is this Bill Rivers? Yes. Are you an aerospace engineering major? Yes. Do you speak Russian? Who's calling? It was 1988. Well, this is Professor Melnick. Oh, Professor Melnick, I'm working on the problem set right now. I'll have it, in the morning for class. And I'm not worried about that. I need to talk to you before class. I'm like, okay, what have I done this time? I was a decent engineering student, but not a great one. I was a much better Russian student. So I showed up early, and he said, well, we have perestroika and glasnost. So perestroika was Gorbachev's idea of restructuring everything. And that's literally rebuilding, and glasnost means openness. And so the Russians had money because the ruble was pegged to the dollar. So at least in the formal, bank currency rates, the Russians had money. I think the black market rate, that was like 200 rubles to the dollar, but not that I would know anything about that.
Well, I remember those days.
Yeah, and so they were doing joint projects, joint space projects, and so this was a scientific and technical negotiations for a joint Soviet-American Earth X-ray observatory. So it was a satellite that was going to have its cameras pointed at the Earth and the X-ray spectrum taking pictures of the Earth. And we chatted a bit. And Professor Melnick was a heritage speaker, Russian, had come to the States in the 40s after the war with his parents. And he gives me a number to call, and it's the owner of the agency. And I talked to her in Russian for 3 minutes. She says, "Okay, show up next Thursday at 8 o'clock at Goddard Space Flight Center, which is 5 miles from the university, something like that." I walked in, and they hand me a microphone. There's the director of the Soviet Space Agency. There's the director of NASA. Translate their speech. Don't interpret, but that's okay. That was my introduction. And then I think a lot of people have heard this story. I get submitted invoice. A couple weeks later, I get a check. I take it to the bank. A couple weeks later, the check comes back, stamped NSF, non-sufficient funds. I go to the address on the check. This is like, a month after I've done the invoice or whatever. And they'd left with no forwarding address. you know, so it was like a microcosm of all the kind of things that happen to linguists in the language industry, and linguists being interpreters and translators. But I did that on or off for 9 years, and sometimes it was my main job, sometimes it was my side hustle. Later got a PhD in Russian linguistics, worked for the intelligence community as a contractor, worked at a think tank at the University of Maryland. I taught at the University of Maryland, was in the private sector for 5 years as a chief scientist, another defense contractor. And then for the last 13 years, I've been a lobbyist and advocate. In the last 5 years, I've run my own lobbying organization, but all focused on the language space, language education, and now really on the language industry, the translation, interpreting, localization industry that in the U.S. is anywhere between 25 and $30 billion a year, and it serves the world is linguistically diverse, right? Culturally, linguistically diverse. Yet English is kind of the global lingua franca, but there are lots of places where, even in a major European city, like you can go to Paris and, get 2 blocks off the main drag, off the Champs-Élysées, or one of the main shopping center, shopping areas, tourist areas. You can walk into a restaurant or a shop and they don't speak English, or if you have a complication at your hotel, like a fire breaks out. This actually happened to us when we were in Madrid, and everything was in Spanish because the person was, excited and upset and stressed and telling everybody to get out and take their luggage. So yeah, there's English. English in the U.S., that's the de facto official language. I know we're going to come back to that.
As of
right?
now, against our constitution, I should say.
Well, it's de facto, not de jure. So it's in fact. So anyway, the language industry supports all of this communication with linguistically, culturally diverse clientele, whether that is in terms of global trade or whether that's in terms of providing interpreters for language access. Now, you touched upon English as the official language. President Trump issued an executive order, I think 2 weeks ago tomorrow. So today is Friday, the 14th of March when we're recording this. And that executive order declared that English shall be the official language of the U.S. Now, the president can issue executive orders, and there have been more than 14,000 executive orders issued that have got a number on them since they started tracking them and putting numbers on them. But it's binding only on the executive branch of the federal government. So it's like the executive order renaming the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America. I don't have to call it the Gulf of America. I don't work for President Trump. I'm not in the executive branch. So that's the first point. The second point is executive orders can't change laws, and they can't overturn legal decisions that come out of the federal courts. Mm-hmm. So we've never had in our Constitution or in any federal law an official language. Like, so Canada, you've got 2 official languages in the Constitution, French and English. Kazakhstan has Kazakh and Russian. Ukraine has Ukrainian, but the U.S. does not have a single official language.
I want to specify here because I want to be crystal clear. U.S. Constitution does not designate on state language, correct?
It does not designate a language for the United States. Now,
I really want to pedal back a little bit.
Okay.
Did our president try to change the Constitution?
Not really. He wants people to think he has this power.
He wants people to think that he's doing this, right?
It's very symbolic because the reality since July 4th, 1776, that the government of the United States operates primarily in English.
I want to pedal back a little bit.
Okay.
Because he is making it a big deal. And I also hear from people on social media, you know me, I'm a social media junkie. And then I hear from people, it's not a big deal, whatever, it's just in English. But I want people to understand that it is a big deal because according to our Constitution, we do not have a state language.
Right. We don't have a national language. There's Supreme Court case law going back to at least 1923, that a case called Meyer versus Nebraska, 1923 decision and there's more decisions since then in federal appeals courts and in the Supreme Court that say that, in fact, you can't really restrict languages. People can use whatever language they want in their private lives, whatever language they want in the workplace, as long as it's not a matter of workplace safety or dealing with clientele. You're not going to speak Spanish to your Chinese-speaking clientele. That doesn't make any sense, right? That's very practical. And then there's a history in the United States of the English-only movement. There's groups like Pro-English and English First and English USA that are very tightly allied with some very anti-immigrant groups. Some of these groups have been labeled, like Pro-English, have been labeled hate groups by the Southern Poverty Law Center, where this isn't about, it's not a big deal because everybody already speaks English, and everyone who doesn't speak English is probably trying to learn English. It's very common, right? I mean, almost everyone who's in the States is, if you're not Native American, Alaska Native, or Hawaiian, your people came here from somewhere else, whether they came willingly or not. And they, if you weren't coming from, the British Isles, you didn't speak English, or Canada, and even like my ancestors that came from Ireland spoke Irish as their first language. So yeah, everyone comes here and learns English, but when you show up at the doctor's office, when you show up as a defendant or a witness in court, the answer cannot be, well, come back when you learn English, because you need to, that interaction has to happen at that time. But this is really part of a whole set of executive orders that are trying to, that they're anti-immigrant. And yes, there are people who are here who are undocumented, and Trump wants to throw them all out. Okay, and under the law, if you don't have status here, you can be deported. Okay, that's the law. But to go further beyond that and say we're going to take away safe spaces, we're going to allow immigration authorities to conduct raids at schools and school buses and hospitals and places of worship, even though we haven't seen any of that happening yet, there was an executive order saying that's allowable now. If you're going to say, okay, this is an English-only country, that really is and it's all part of a whole, set of things that are genuinely anti-immigrant.
Can you pedal back a little bit, because
Sure.
I'm curious. Do you think that executive order just came out of the blue, or it's not connected to each other, or do you think this executive order is connected to bigger immigration reform or strategy that we are currently experiencing?
It is my opinion that it is connected. We don't have proof of that, but the rhetoric, the moves that have been taken are very consistent with the agendas of a number of, a dozen or so far-right advocacy groups. There's FAIR, which deals with immigration. There's, Pro-English. There are a number of others. And that all have their roots with a retired ophthalmologist from Western Michigan, now has since passed on, a guy named John Tanton, who is a noted eugenicist and white supremacist, and took up the cause of English only. It was originally championed. There have been proposals to have English as an official language over, the last at least 50 years. They never go anywhere, at least in Congress. And originally championed by Senator Hayakawa from California, then Senator Hayakawa from California in the late 1970s. But it's been taken over as part of this anti-immigrant thing. And when you look at what happened at the state level, so there was the English-only movement that swept across the country in the late 80s and the early 90s. And places like California said, we're an English-only state. That was voted in, the voters chose to be English-only. It's still on the books. We'll come back to California later because it's irrelevant for a lot of different reasons. Arizona, and in both California and Arizona, part of that movement was to require that immigrant kids who didn't speak English would be immersed in English only. They wouldn't get any support in their native languages. And that actually turned out to be really damaging for their education. It's common sense that immersion's the best way to learn, and you just submerge people in English. Well, there's enormous amounts of research that show actually that, get kids to read in their strongest language first, and they will then do much better in school. And that if you're bilingual by the time you get out of high school in America, you get to college at higher rates, you graduate from college sooner, you make more money than your monolingual peers, all of this stuff. And that if you use more than one language throughout your life, the symptoms, the onset of the symptoms of Alzheimer's or dementia is delayed by 4 to 5 years. Your brain may still be rotting away, but it's a stronger brain. It has more redundancy. It has more plasticity, more flexibility. All of this research, and there's 30, 40 years of research on the benefits of being bilingual and how that affects educational outcomes and people's livelihoods, people's health. And yet, these laws that were passed in the late 80s, early 90s, making English the official language of any number of states.
Can I add to this? Because if you remember with the deaf community in 80s, mid-80s, late 80s, there was a similar trend when deaf people were not allowed to use ASL and they were pushed to use English as a native language. And there is this whole conversation right now, I think, with the current administration, why we have to provide ASL interpretation, because deaf people can read captions, even though English indeed is not their native language. Their native language is ASL. It's sort of like goes into, I don't know if you, in your opinion, can you connect those things together?
Yeah. I mean, there was a right-wing commentator, Charlie Kirk, who complained about the briefings that Karen Bass was giving, the mayor of Los Angeles, during the fires recently, and complained about the distraction that the sign language interpreter presented being on the screen. And that's really, it goes beyond being ableist. It's really it's discriminatory, it's insulting. The reality is that the vast majority of deaf individuals in the U.S. are born to hearing parents. So you put yourself in those parents' shoes, and your baby comes out, and you find out the baby is deaf. You speak English or Russian or whatever. Now you have to learn sign language in order to communicate with your child who cannot hear you.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, there's a tradition of teaching lip reading, of all sorts of speech therapy and support to allow deaf people to speak in English, but ASL is the stronger option. And it's a really challenging space for language and communication access, because there are lots of different sort of patterns, right, within the deaf community, and lots of different preferences as to how to communicate. But if someone wants an interpreter, we'll just give them an interpreter. If that's the way they communicate with the world, if they communicate with the world through ASL, facilitate that, right?
And we really want to emphasize here for our listeners that English is
not ASL. And ASL is not a signed version of English. It's a completely different language.
Yeah, and I really want, because when I talk to some of the communities who really struggle to understand that deaf person can just read English. No, they cannot, because ASL to some degree is based on French. Even so, it's a 3D language, but it has nothing to do with English and comprehension of English. It's just the same as for you. And I know you speak Spanish, and your Spanish is fantastic. But for me to start learning Chinese in a box, because I cannot hear, that's what would be for a deaf person to start learning English.
It's I talked about ableism because I'm a former interpreter. I speak several languages. I have.
How many languages do you speak?
7.
Can you tell us which languages you speak?
Sure, English and French. English first, also some French from my childhood. That was my father's heritage language, Quebecois French. Learned Russian starting in high school, and that became my professional language. I lived in Central Asia for a year in the 90s. Spanish. Gracias a mi conocimiento de francés y todos mis amigos argentinos, porteños y cubanos. German, Irish, and Ukrainian. So Ukrainian's my weakest.
So you're very aware of all the needs.
Yeah, but
and nuances.
But if you're hearing, it's fundamentally different. And I have a lot of friends who are ASL interpreters. Most of them are child of deaf adults. Some of them are, second language, so heritage signers, if you will. Some of them are second language learners of ASL, but they're still hearing. They are. It's fundamentally different in a way that is kind of hard to explain. That if I can go to a francophone country and work there and participate. I can go and live in a Russian-speaking country and participate, and no one really remarks on my presence. I know I'm not really part of that culture. I mean, I know something about the culture. I have some affinity to it, maybe, but I'm still fundamentally this American person. But it's different if you're an ASL interpreter versus a deaf person, because you're never on the other side, right? You can still hear. And so the point about, coming all the way back to taking ASL interpreters away from press briefings, complaining about the accommodation, saying, oh, captioning is enough, and we can just turn the captioning over to AI. That's not. First off, there's a law, the Americans with Disabilities Act, which requires reasonable accommodations be made. A deaf person requests an interpreter, you're generally supposed to provide the interpreter. There are some exceptions, but any event that I've run where somebody requested an interpreter, from a Zoom meeting to a conference, business meetings, we'll get an interpreter. We just do it. It doesn't really cost that much in the grand scheme of things. I mean, we do pay our interpreters well in the industry, but the benefits of being inclusive far outweigh the costs. And that's the same for spoken languages too.
So I ask you about what languages you speak, because I want our listeners to be. We want to be crystal clear for our listeners that we are not against the fact that people who come to US need to learn English. Yes, we want people to learn English or any other language for this matter. You learn 7 languages. I have a few, not 7. But
How many do you have? How many do you have?
Well, 2.5 at this point. I forgot some of the languages that I used to speak simply because I live here now. But the whole point is, yes, we need to speak as many languages as we can, and English obviously is the leading language, not just in US, but across the globe. However, yes, there is a constitution, and yes, people come here, and yes, a lot of people who come here, they learn English. But there are situations, well, while they are learning the language, they need immediate assistance, and providing that immediate assistance, the rest of us benefit, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So when you look at healthcare, so you have to remember just how diverse America is. We have about 350 million residents, the latest census estimates. Roughly 75 million. So that's more than 20%. Speak a language other than English at home. And the census lists more than 350 languages. For really boring technical reasons that I could turn this into a graduate seminar on survey sampling and design and statistics. I won't do that. But I've taught that class before. The actual number is probably closer to 800 immigrant languages, including English. There was a survey that was done in New York City a couple of years ago. It's a book called Language City. I forget the author's name, and I apologize to him in advance, that showed more than 800 languages spoken just in the city of New York. And you add to that 150 or so Native American, Alaska Native, Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander languages that are still spoken. You're close to 1,000 languages. And so that's 75 million people speaking a lot of different languages. Spanish is the biggest. It's about 60%, maybe a little more. I don't have the figure off the top of my head. So if you're asked this question on in your college course, don't put down 60%. Speak Spanish. But then there's that long tail of other languages. So another 9 or 10 languages with about 1 million speakers each, and then all the way out to very small numbers. And that's because everybody's coming here to try to make a better life. They're escaping political repression, violence, economic stress in their home countries, or they're just coming here from maybe coming here from a place that is nice, but they want to try to build a life here and a business here, and yes, they're all learning English, but when they show up at the doctor's office, when they show up at the, the meeting with the school counselor, and they don't speak English, the response cannot be come back when you learn English, or go find an interpreter, right? Because federal law says no. If the entity providing the service is a recipient of federal funds, then it must provide the language access.
Now it's taken away.
Actually, it's not.
It's not? Okay,
No,
well,
because
can you give
yeah,
us those
yeah.
three
So
statutes that we are still protected by?
so this executive order did three things, and everyone focuses on English as the official language, which is it's symbolic, it's divisive, and it's essentially completely ineffectual because, again, that's not he can't make new law through an executive order. For all sorts of practical reasons, English is the de facto official language, but it is not de jure. It's not in law. So it's a symbolic gesture. It's not one that I particularly like because I know the history of this movement, but it's a symbolic gesture. The second part of that executive order revoked, or rescinded, I think is the official term, an executive order signed by Bill Clinton in August of 2000, Executive Order 13166. And again, it bound only the executive branch of the federal government, not the Congress, not the judiciary, not the state and local governments or schools or anything else. But it required federal agencies to develop language access policies and plans. And it required those agencies to, in turn, require their recipients and grantees to develop language access policies and plans if they had clientele that didn't speak English. Okay. But what it really derived from was Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which says no one shall be discriminated against on the basis of race, color, national origin. So that's number one. And that's still the law. And it says no one person may be discriminated against. And then a Supreme Court case that was decided in 1974, a unanimous court case, Lau versus Nichols, Lau versus Nichols, Nichols, if you want to look it up. And that was brought by a Cantonese-speaking family in San Francisco that was suing the school system, and Mr. Nichols was the superintendent of schools, so that's why he got his name on this case, because their children were not being provided an equal education. It was basically English only, no communication to the parents or to the children in their native language. And what the Supreme Court ruled unanimously in 1974 was that is the same. Discriminating on the basis of language is the same as discriminating on national origin. So if I were to say, you come back with an interpreter because you speak only Russian, then I am discriminating against you because of your language, which is the same as discriminating against you because of your nationality. That's illegal in the U.S. And the Supreme Court said, yes, language status is the same as national origin. It is inseparable from national origin. So you can't discriminate based on that. And since 1974, the language industry kind of evolved first in the healthcare space and then in the public safety space, providing, like Language Line was founded in, I think, 1975. And if you're watching this, Scott Klein or Simon Yaxon Grant or anybody else from Language Line, I apologize if I get the date wrong. I should know this. But it was founded because of the need to communicate with Vietnamese immigrants in San Jose and in the Salinas Valley when they were calling the brand new 911 centers. And so, so it came about because of the practical reasons of language access. Like, you've got to be able to communicate with your patient. You have to be able to communicate with the defendant or the witnesses. You've got to be able to communicate with the parents of kids in school if there's a disciplinary thing going on, or if they're eligible to apply for some advanced program, if they have special needs and an individualized education plan. You have to be able to communicate with people in order for those services to be delivered. You're not delivering the service if you can't communicate. And so from 1974 on, the language industry really has grown to meet those needs. Like I say, first in healthcare, second in public safety, third in sort of the legal setting outside of courtrooms, because that's often covered by separate laws that that govern whether you get a court interpreter or not. And then in 2000, the Clinton administration wrote this executive order in response to a case that was working its way through the federal courts called Sandoval versus Alexander. And Senora Sandoval was a Mexican immigrant in Alabama who wanted to take a driver's license test in Spanish because she didn't speak English. And the Alabama DMV said, no, you have to take it in English. Now, at that time, they were offering tests in French and German to executives from, multinational companies that were building factories in Alabama and neighboring Georgia. So it was clearly discriminatory. And the courts were consistently ruling as it worked its way up through the federal court system that this was discriminatory, that because the Alabama DMV, the Alabama Department of Transportation received federal funding, it was obligated in all of its public-facing services to provide language access, and then that the taxpayer would have to cover that. Now, this is 25 years ago, and so I may be remembering I may be not entirely accurate in all my details. What the Clinton administration did, it creates this executive order that says that you, Alabama DMV, or the Maryland state parks, have to pay for the interpreter. Not, the federal government's not going to pay for the interpreter, but you, the recipient of federal funding, have to pay for the interpreter. And so when the case goes to the Supreme Court, the issue of whether or not language access was required of federal recipients was essentially rendered moot. And so the court decided something else we may talk about how you get, how those rights are enforced and protected. And then, you think, okay, recipient of federal funding, that's every state government, every local government, with very few exceptions, every school system gets federal funding. And if you get even $1 of it in all of your activities, you're supposed to not discriminate. Now, part of the reason that they, that the Clinton administration said in this executive order that, it's not going to come out of the federal budget, the language access, is because under Title VI, you don't get extra money to not discriminate. You're just supposed to not discriminate. That is on you as a school system, as an employer, as a healthcare provider, as a state government agency. You're not supposed to discriminate, and you don't get paid for doing that, for not discriminating. But unlike the non-discrimination around, say, race and color, providing language access, just like providing communication access, which is covered under the Americans with Disabilities Act, requires you to actively do something, and that requires resources. So that executive order goes away, and that was a long explanation. But the underlying laws, the Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, Lau v. Nichols, Section 1557 of Obamacare, which covers non-discrimination in healthcare and applies to virtually every healthcare provider in the United States, public or private, government, whatever, and a number of other laws contain provisions that say you can't discriminate based on language status. So it's still the law of the land. The executive order really doesn't change that. The third thing it is, and the third thing, so English is the official language. We're getting rid of this old executive order 13166. And the third thing is that any guidance that was based on executive order 13166 is to be rescinded, is to be removed. Now, guidance is exactly that. It's not binding. It's, if you're going to do this, we think you should do it this way. We recommend you do it this way. It comes from the federal government, but it's not a regulation. It's not a law. And so we've seen a lot of that guidance has actually been pulled off of federal websites. And then the courts are still there. The civil offices of civil rights, even though they've been shrunk significantly in the last few weeks, they're still there. People can still file an online complaint.
Can you clarify that? Because you and I chatted briefly before we started the podcast. Because what I want to understand is that now we have the executive order. I believe that we are waiting for the Department of Justice to issue the guidelines. We don't have the guidelines yet.
Right.
So that's, I guess, the next what we need
That's
to get.
the next thing to see.
So the two things what I would like to get the clarification. So we need to get the guidelines how to work with the. So we are waiting for the guidelines from the Department of Justice how to work with the executive order. Nevertheless, the statutes, Title 6, 1557 of the Affordable Care Act, and of course ADA will not be moved because those are the statutes that will always protect us. And then the third one I would like to hear from you is that the places where we can file the complaints are shrinking.
Yes. So there are federal offices of civil rights at every department, every major agency, and those were established through a different statute. And they accept civil rights complaints, which may relate to Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, may relate to age-based discrimination, may relate to disability-based discrimination, may relate to gender-based discrimination. And there's an online form at the U.S. Department of Justice Office of Civil Rights where you can file a complaint. The concern that a lot of us have in the language access community is that because of the reductions in force, the layoffs in the federal government have really hit these offices of civil rights pretty hard. Some of them have lost half or more of their staff and seen several of their regional offices close. They all have, wherever the agency is headquartered, that's where they have the main office of civil rights. But then there's offices of civil rights throughout the U.S. and the agencies divide up the U.S. in different regions, and so the concern is there won't be as many people to investigate the claims, and that because it's just the Office of Civil Rights, the Department of Health and Human Services or the Department of Justice has discretion as to what complaints it investigates, that they might not be as willing to investigate language-based discrimination. But we have to wait and see. It's like we have to wait and see what the guidance is. We have to wait and see what the state of enforcement is from the offices of civil rights. And the way that civil rights complaints work, you don't have to be the person who is discriminated against to file a complaint. If you have material knowledge, if you have facts about someone being discriminated against for whatever reason, you can file a complaint on their behalf. And that's something people don't really understand. If you want to go to the courts, then yes, the person who was discriminated against has to be the one who files the suit, the civil suit in federal courts. I talked about that Alexander v. Sandoval or Sandoval v. Alexander case it was finally decided in 2003. And what the Supreme Court then held was that if the discrimination is disparate treatment, no Irish need apply, then that is on its face discriminatory, and the person who's been discriminated against has the right to go to federal court. They can also file a civil rights complaint. If it's disparate impact, no redheads need apply. Okay, so you're going to screen out a lot of Irish Americans that way, well, not all of them. Then that's called disparate impact. And that theory comes from the early 70s when other parts of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 banned hiring practices based on gender. So it used to be you had to be a man to be a fireman or a cop, right? That's like we call it fireman still. Policeman, police officer, right? A firefighter. And what any number of police and fire departments said, oh, you have to be 5'10". Well, what's the average height of a woman in the U.S. is like 5'6". And you have to be able to do X number of pull-ups, and you have to be able to bench, 200 pounds, whatever it is, because women generally don't have the same upper body strength as men. And federal courts found those to be discriminatory as disparate impact. They weren't saying explicitly we're not going to hire women as police officers or firefighters or pilots, but you got to pass these tests that you're probably not going to pass, because we're going to kind of, rig the system a bit. It was also discriminatory against short people, which, I can see why that would be bothersome. Not that I'm short or anything. I'm short.
Oh.
But so under that disparate treatment, no Irish need apply. We don't want to treat Russian patients here. You go to federal court, or you can file a civil rights complaint. Disparate impact, no redheads. No, we're not going to provide an interpreter. then that's the Supreme Court said you have to file a civil rights complaint. And so that's the concern, that most covered entities, most recipients of federal funding are not going to have as policies, right, to be openly discriminatory. But they might have practices, policies in place that are discriminatory because of the impact they have, like maybe not providing interpreters. And so, we still see that, unfortunately. Sometimes it's the person at the front desk. They haven't gotten the memo, or, they're having a bad day, or they have some kind of attitude, and they say, come back, with an interpreter, or no, we're not going to get you an interpreter. And that is still the responsibility of that healthcare facility. The healthcare facility is still on the hook, but sometimes it's an isolated incident. Sometimes it's an issue of not having enough training, not having the systems in place to get interpreters, or to identify the patients, talking about healthcare again, the patients who need interpreters. But yeah, that, right now, the option there is to file a civil rights complaint. And again, our concern is with the civil rights offices being really cut back, and because it's at their discretion as to what they want to investigate.
Well, because
we are concerned. We
because
have to wait and see.
Yeah, because you and I started it right in our conversation, that both of us believe that it is a part of the larger strategy of the current administration. And what I would like to bring because you just sort of started talking about the healthcare, and what I would like to sort of bring the conversation to the point where, let's say somebody says, I don't care about discrimination. I don't care about those immigrants or people who do not speak English. That's their problem. They need to start speaking English. I believe that everybody cares about money, and everybody cares about economy, and everybody cares about the tax revenue, because that's where our country can prosper. So our industry, that's because language industry, I don't know what the numbers you have. I was looking because different sources give different numbers right now. We have CSA, then we have Slater, then we have NIMSI, and when I look at those resources, we are talking about billions that language industry generates. What numbers do you have? It's like
30 billion is the estimate I've seen. I think
depending if you have technology or you do not have, if it's service or service and technology. But in general, we are looking about maybe from 50 to 70 to 80 billion of revenue that this industry generates
globally, and the U.S. is the single biggest market.
And U.S. is a leading one. Because we are leading in AI, we are leading in technology, and etc.
We're leading in language access. We're leaders in providing remote interpreting, whether over the phone or through, video remote interpreting.
So this is the industry that generates revenue, generates tax revenue, and this is the industry that creates jobs.
Yep.
So I'm just saying that, you do not care about discrimination, you do not care about civil rights, you surely do care about money. So can you and I maybe together, but I want to hear your opinion because you're the one, you're the guest here. So let's talk about from 3 to 5 highlights that will benefit the economy.
So in no particular order of importance, just as they pop into my head. The first is that in terms of healthcare, providing language access correlates very highly with better patient adherence to instructions. So discharge instructions, pre-op instructions, prescription instructions, lower readmission rates, lower malpractice claims. All of those add up to money in the pockets. If you can get those kind of benefits as a healthcare provider, you're going to be making more money off of that patient and their insurance than if you have to readmit them, or if there's a malpractice claim because you didn't provide language access or you provided inadequate language access. And the studies show that ROI can be pretty significant. I've seen 10 to 1, I've seen other numbers. We're waiting on a meta-analysis of all the research on this area in language access in healthcare, but it's pretty clear that investing in language access in healthcare benefits the patients have better lives and better outcomes, but it also benefits the bottom line of the healthcare provider. The same thing in education. If you're providing language access to parents, they're going to be making more informed decisions about their children's education. Their kids are more likely to be, if the parents don't know about an accelerated program, an advanced program, or some other opportunity, they're not going to be able to get their kids into it. So the kids are going to get a better education if you have to keep the parents informed. And as a father too, I very much want to know what's going on in my kid's schooling. Although one of them's off at college, and he's doing his own thing now. Number three, it generates economic activity everywhere in the U.S. There are language companies in every city in the U.S., every state in the U.S. We estimate that there are between 150 and 200,000 working translators and interpreters. Many work part-time, many do it as a side hustle, but the best data we have, there's Department of Labor data that we don't really think is very accurate. But if you look at, say, the American Translators Association surveys, people who you can work full-time, and make $80,000 as a translator and more as an interpreter. A lot of people don't work full-time because they're independent contractors. They want the flexibility and what have you. But that's a professional middle-class wage. And then the language industry itself has grown 5% a year every year, including during the 1 year in the pandemic. The first year it was kind of level because we had a big dip when the shutdown happened, but then recovered pretty quickly. And so those companies are paying taxes. The contractors and employees are paying taxes. And then U.S. companies that rely on the language industry to sell their goods and services to multilingual, multicultural markets here in the U.S., remembering that there are something like 40 million Spanish speakers, even though a lot of them also speak English, there's a market there. And there's, whatever we're doing with tariffs and what have you, American companies trade globally. And in order to sell those products and services, you have to be able to sell in the language of the customer. And so we're the ones who facilitate that. And we're the ones that help open those markets up to U.S. companies that are selling outside to other companies that are selling here. So yeah, there's a significant economic leverage that we have, even though, you say $30 billion is a big number. And okay, that's a big number. I'd love to have $30 billion. Actually, I don't know if I would. But it's a $17-18 trillion economy the last time I looked, and it's grown since then. So it's, a fairly small sector in the economy. But the other part is that language services, like I said, they're in every state and pretty much almost every place in the U.S. needs language services because of the diversity of our population. There are language companies all over the U.S. But we're also involved in pretty much every industry. We're part of healthcare, which is the biggest sector of the economy. We're part of education, which I think is the third biggest sector of the economy. We're part of the overall services industry. We're part of manufacturing. We're part of resource extraction in terms of helping companies, nonprofits, government agencies, healthcare systems, et cetera, communicate with their clients. Correct. So we have we're kind of invisible in a way because
that's the point of our industry, to be invisible. I remember when I was taking my classes back in university, I was told that the best language specialist, like you become perfect when you become invisible, because you facilitate, like you want two people or two organizations or two governments to communicate fluently between each other with you being in the back. So we were trained to be invisible.
Yeah, and that's especially if you're a conference interpreter and you're sitting in a booth somewhere in this big meeting hall, your voice is coming through a headset, but people aren't going to see you. But we're, I think, much more visible as interpreters now because of, again, the growth of healthcare interpreting, where you're often seeing the interpreter on a screen. Obviously, ASL, you have to see the interpreter in ASL because it's a visual language. And and yet, we're our job as linguists, as translators, captioners, whatever it is to faithfully convey a message, to preserve the integrity of the communication, and not to put ourselves into it. I think that's what, on
It's
the
a humble
professional side,
it's a
yeah,
humble profession. We are there, but we are not
yeah.
there, right? Like it's just through the centuries.
And if you're browsing the Porsche website late at night, that has been localized. You have to click your region. I admit, if I had the if I had the float, I'd probably be driving a Porsche. But um, if my wife watches this, she already knows I have this problem. Um, uh, but we'll put the kids through school first and save for retirement. The that website has been localized, right? It's controlled from Stuttgart or wherever Porsche is headquartered. And sure, there's content generated in each country, but like the specs and everything, the descriptions, content generated in Germany but presented to a global audience. And there are companies that do that localization work, that do transcreation, that create marketing material into other, take your marketing ideas and put them into other languages and cultures, not just straight up translating a script, but making sure that you've got the color palette right and the imagery right and the kind of metaphors that culture responds to, correct? People have no idea, if you're not in the industry, that's going on. And that goes on at a
Yes,
pretty massive scale.
precisely. And the website marketing brands that are being localized are doing so much better. Like it's like 65% success. The research shows
Yeah,
than those who are not being localized.
yeah, yeah. And so then people say, well, won't AI cover this? So YouTube just announced this week for their preferred channels. And if you've got a channel on YouTube, there's an opt out if you don't want the AI dubbing. But it's very interesting because when you look at the announcement, it says, be aware. This is YouTube saying, be aware. The AI is going to make mistakes. It's going to be inaccurate, et cetera, et cetera. It's like, yeah, you can have the AI. I wouldn't necessarily, and it might make your content available in ways it wouldn't be, but you're not really sure if that's going to be accurate.
First of all, it's not going to be accurate. We already know that. Secondly, from what I have been checking the latest algorithm on social media, that the algorithm are picking up the difference between AI-driven content and human-driven content. The AI-driven content is not going to be picked up by algorithm.
Is not going to be
No,
picked up.
it's not.
Yeah.
So because the algorithm knows the difference.
Yeah.
So we really need to be very careful how we are
There's
working with the content.
the
now.
Spanish government passed a law this month that requires AI generated content to have an AI label on it.
Correct.
And maybe someday we'll have that. I don't think with this administration because they're very
No, we
tech.
are not.
And like, okay, so I'm an American. You're going to take this iPhone from my cold dead hands, right? We love our tech. We love our apps. Love shiny new things. Maybe that's just kind of a human thing, but yeah, you have to be careful when you trust the technology. Like Google Maps is really pretty impressive. It can still make mistakes. It can still send you to an exit that's closed or down a dead end street because it doesn't have the detailed local knowledge. It'll get better, and you can help Google make it better. You can do free work for them by saying it made a mistake. But the AI for the language industry it's AI has been used in translation. It's called machine translation. The first commercially viable machine translation product came out in I think 2002. That's a generation now where we've been using machine translation, integrating it into the translation workflow in all sorts of interesting ways. In 1988 when I was first a translator, this was the computer, and this was my first technology was an IBM Selectric ball. IBM electric typewriter was called the Selectric, and you got this steel ball that had all the characters on it, and I got a Cyrillic ball. Then I had to go buy a used Selectric typewriter to stick around it, so that I wasn't paying somebody else to type up my handwritten translations, right? the world has changed so much in the last 37 years, almost 40 years. And so, yeah, the language industry has been using technology pretty much since forever, right? You think of the first interpreters, the first conference interpreters were in Nuremberg, and they were using headsets.
Yeah,
You
I
know,
remember that. That's where they all
headsets and
started, so to speak.
sitting in booths. And now
Yeah.
we have, you can get an interpreter on your iPhone, a human interpreter through apps on your iPhone. So yeah, I'm not really concerned about the technology from inside the industry. I do worry that consumers will trust it more than they should. And, for some things, sure, Google Translate or some speech to speech application is fine. Going to the doctor's office, sitting in a courtroom, at a disciplinary hearing at your child's school, that's not the place for it. You do need a human because.
And that's the reason why I wanted to bring it back to, in the beginning, to our conversation, that the reason why we need government regulations.
Yeah.
Because anywhere that technology comes to the human life, that's where the concern is with the current administration, because with the previous administration we had regulation on AI.
Yeah, they were starting towards that. I'm not anti-technology. I'm not anti-AI.
Neither of us, and I want to make it very clear to our guests and listeners here that nobody has any problems with using technology and integrating AI into our lives. We just need to make sure that when it comes to the human life, we need to be very clear what the human is going to be verifying the content.
Yeah, it's not just human in the loop, it's the human in control of the process. And AI, the large language models are actually an outgrowth of neural machine translation, which is an outgrowth of statistical machine translation, just on a hypermassive scale, but it's still basically predicting the next string of text based on all of the data that it's ingested. And you can think of like asking ChatGPT to write an essay. Well, you're doing kind of an English to English translation, right? It's just going out and finding stuff and putting it together. There are lots of technical issues, and I don't want, that's for kind of a different audience, I think. But the bottom line is that AI still hallucinates. It makes stuff up. You don't want that in a court case. You do not want that in an interaction with your doctor. Making stuff up symptoms you may not have, medications that your doctor isn't prescribing, and it makes errors. It makes errors that a competent human translator would never make, and it does it inconsistently. 9 times out of 10, it will get. I'll give my favorite sentence in Spanish for a number of years has been "La vacuna no se necesita." The vaccine is not necessary. It is a perfectly grammatical sentence in Spanish. The original is vaccine is not mandatory. So mandatory and necessary are two different concepts.
And where was it used? You said that it was during the pandemic.
It was during the pandemic. It was on the Virginia Department of Health's COVID vaccination information page, and it was Google Translate. And Google Translate probably gets that 9 times out of 10. We come up with a no es necesaria, and that would be it is not necessary, right? There are some more felicitous Spanish translations, I suppose, but this time it got it wrong, and whoever published that website, whoever hit the button to make that website go live, didn't catch it, and we don't know if that person was bilingual or not, or just there weren't any red squiggles under it in the Google Doc, so it looks like it's spelled right. Ran the spell check, but it was wrong, and it changes the meaning of the sentence. And so there is, in fact, a regulation under Section 1557 of the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare. There is a regulation that says if you're using machine translation for language access in healthcare for anything that affects health benefits, rights, or that is nuanced or complex, I forget, there's a fairly long list of criteria. Pretty much anything that's vital information, you have to have that machine translation reviewed by a qualified human translator. It's not saying we're not going to use it. It's just you've got to, and that's what a lot of translators are doing now. They're doing what's called post-editing machine translation. And in some ways, that's a more cognitively demanding task because now you're looking for errors and mismatches and you have to pay more attention, and you have to make sure that the ideas in the source are faithfully represented in the target text, and that's kind of a different set of processes than taking one sentence and turning it into one sentence, one paragraph, turning it into a paragraph in another language. So it's again, it's not anti-technology, but I would be very reluctant to rely on AI in any situation where life, health, rights, benefits were at risk. Now there'll be some situations where it can be very helpful. There's some use of machine translation now, for example, emergency warnings on people's phones. It's pilots of that. Okay. Is it better than nothing, though? In the general, we don't really know. We don't really know. It's just kind of untested. And again, I used to be an engineer, I'm pretty comfortable with technology, but I'm not turning everything over to it,
Right.
So.
Well, Will, thank you so much. We have to meet together and talk about AI in a separate conversation.
Yeah. It's interesting how the conversation kind of wanders around a bit. I mean, the bottom line is language access is still the law of the land, and we still have 75 million people who are speaking another language, 26 million who don't speak English, and there's the moral duty to provide them with language access when they need it at the doctor's office, at the social services agency, wherever they are. There's the civil rights imperative, the civil rights law, and federal statutes as well as Supreme Court case law. And then there's the economic argument that whatever service you're delivering is going to be more efficient if you've got good communication. It will take less resources to deliver this service, and if there's if there's a return on that, something like healthcare, you can actually measure that and show that, we're going to get more back by providing language access than what we're putting into it.
Thank you, Bill, and thank you for joining us. And to all our listeners, I encourage you to visit Bill's. We'll provide contact information if you have any additional questions to Bill. For any additional information, you probably should look at Slate Report. They released quite at least one good podcast on the executive order, as well as NIMZ. Bill was the guest on both Slate Report and NIMZ. As well as I will ask you to think about the civil rights. If you're not so into civil rights as a result of this executive order, think about economy, because we all do care where our children will be living tomorrow, which country, and how this country will end up based on our actions today. Again, thank you for joining us. Please help us growing our communities. My team will be very grateful for your support. Thank you for tuning in into Connected Conversation. We truly value your feedback and would love to hear from you. Please let us know what story you would like to hear next. Share your thoughts in the comment section. Let's keep the conversation going, and let's continue to inspire each other. Let's stay in touch. Thank you.